Chapter 1, Exio Exuin is not dead. Do Qi continent, Central Plains, Dual Emperor Abyss. Bang. The world shook and the empty space shattered. The natural energy continued to gather toward a cream-white energy swirl in the empty space. A countless number of people on the ground were quietly watching everything that was happening at this moment. Other than a couple of people, everyone in the world, regardless of whether they were humans or magical beasts, had landed on the ground at this moment. Their eyes revealed shock as they watched the scene in the distant sky. Only the eyes of the white-clothed young man in the air emitted a fiery hot glow. His bright eyes were filled with an overflowing fighting intent that soared to the sky, causing the entire empty space to emit waves of trembling sounds. The space around the man was repeatedly struck by this fighting intent that soared to the sky. It forcefully collapsed and recovered. It was as though the entire space would collapse in the blink of an eye if one were to add a little more strength. This caused the two figures standing beside him to sigh endlessly. An elite Do Di was indeed this powerful. Just the rise of the fighting intent within one's body would cause the space to tremble and shatter. An elite Do Di was indeed worthy of being the true peak existence on the Do Qi continent. There were 4 men and 3 women behind the white-clothed young man. There were also 3 children who appeared to be around 11 or 12 years old standing quietly. The few children hugged the 2 beautiful women beside them. The 2 figures also bowed slightly. They extended their hands and hugged the younger children into their embrace. Only a little girl who appeared to be around 13 or 14 years old was still standing in the empty space. Her aura caused one to involuntarily feel shocked. The strength of this little girl, who was only 14 or 15 years old, had actually reached the advanced 8-star Do Sheng class. Such strength was something that one could count with one's fingers even in the entire Do Qi continent. She already possessed such a frightening strength at such a young age. It was difficult to imagine just what kind of frightening level her strength would reach in the future. Even though this was the case, at this moment, the little girl's pair of bright and beautiful eyes were staring intently at the back of the person in front of her, who did not appear to be very tall and straight. Around her eyes, a lustrous glint flickered. This scene also appeared on the few children and the 2 beautiful women beside her. Their red moist eyes caused them to be unable to bear to look at the back of the person in front of them. They were afraid that they would really be unable to control themselves and cry. However, if they did not look, they were afraid that they would never have the opportunity to meet him again. They were afraid that the person in front of them would suddenly disappear in the blink of an eye, never to be found again. After all, everything that was about to happen today was unknown to both of them and him. The 2 beautiful women's Do Sheng. They stared intently at you, Do Sheng. Their moist red lips were tightly pressed together. And their slightly reddened eyes revealed Do Qi. Although they wanted to say something, they were unable to speak of the Do Di Exio Do. The only Do to Do and Do Do were Do Di one. They believed in his strength and believed in the power he possessed. Words of worry should not appear in his mind. They only needed to believe that there was no need to doubt his strength. I have finally waited for this day. Looks like Ancestor's guess was right. Do Di is not the end of this world. There is indeed a peak above Do Di. Exio Yan stared at the jade bottle in his hand. There was a brilliant heavenly flame churning repeatedly deep within his eyes. The expression on his face had also become increasingly fiery hot at this moment. At this moment, Exio Yan could clearly sense the Do Qi ripple on his body gradually becoming more intense. A feeling that had not appeared for over a decade caused Exio Yan's heart to be extremely fiery at this moment. If only I was around when Exio Exuin broke through back then. Perhaps he would not have disappeared from this world. Guyuan by the side involuntarily let out a long sigh when he heard the content from Exio Yan's mouth. An ashamed expression flashed across his face as he softly sighed with a somewhat sorrowful tone. Exio Yan laughed out loud when he heard these words. He laughed loudly and comforted Guyuan. Haha, father-in-law, please be rest assured. Ancestor Exio Exuin has not completely disappeared from this world. What did you say? Exio Exuin is not dead? The spirits of Guyuan and Exio Zhan beside him shook when Exio Yan's words sounded. Even the eyes of Zhu Kun by the side brightened. Zhu Kun had also heard quite a lot of things regarding Exio Exuin over the years. His heart was filled with admiration for the latter. Naturally, he was extremely happy after learning that Exio Exuin was not dead. It was a long while later before Guyuan finally asked Exio Yan with a trembling and excited voice. All they knew was that Exio Exuin had ignited his remaining spiritual strength in order to help Exio Yan's spiritual strength break through the limit of the perfect heavenly state and enter the D state. He had engaged in a great battle with the heavenly tomb spirit before disappearing from this world. However, he was unaware that Exio Yan had collected his spiritual essence. Hence, they were incomparably shocked when they learned of this news. The two of them only came to an understanding after Exio Yan explained the reason. Ha 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 ha, I knew it. He was able to survive with the help of the heavenly tomb even under such circumstances. How can he die so easily? Ha ha. Guyuan, who had understood all of this, laughed heartily. His entire body seemed to have become much younger in an instant. Exio Yan also smiled slightly. He clearly understood in his heart that Guyuan had always felt guilty about the Exio clan's decline. After all, the Exio clan was an ally of the Gu clan back then. However, the Gu clan did not provide much help after Exio Exuin's death, and the Exio clan was destroyed. Guyuan was also hindered by the elders of the clan. This clan head of the Gu clan was powerless even if he wanted to. He felt incomparably guilty in his heart and ultimately felt that the Gu clan owed the Exio clan deep in his heart. Although Exio Yan had already become an emperor, and the Exio clan had risen once again, the guilt in his heart towards the Exio clan's ancestors had not lessened by much. Now that he heard that Exio Exuin was not dead and there was still a possibility of him being resurrected, the guilt in his heart naturally dissipated. As long as Exio Exuin was resurrected and saw that the Exio clan was still around and was even more powerful than when he was still around, everything would naturally be nothing. No matter what Exio Exuin would say, he would have sufficient reason to face him. Haha, but Exio Yan, you brat, why didn't you tell me about such a big matter earlier? You made me feel guilty for so many years. Are you deliberately trying to take revenge on me? When you return, I will definitely make you apologize to me. Guyuan's large palm slapped Exio Yan's shoulder fiercely. His eyes stared intently at Exio Yan as he laughed and teased him. Of course, Exio Yan naturally understood the other meaning behind his words. However, he could only secretly nod his head. Guyuan immediately knit his brows after having sensed the thoughts in Exio Yan's heart. He was just about to say something when Exio Yan changed the topic. He once again laughed out loud and said, "Don't worry. Father-in-law, I didn't do it on purpose. It's just that all these years, I wasn't confident that I could resurrect my ancestor. Therefore, I didn't dare to jump to conclusions. However, until today, I felt that there was a strange movement in my ancestor's soul origin. Only then did I have the confidence to resurrect my ancestor. As for this trip, I don't know if I will be able to return alive. However, I will definitely do my best to return and apologize to father-in-law." As soon as he finished speaking, Exio Yan's eyes met with Guyuan's for a moment. Then, Exio Yan suddenly turned around and no longer paid attention to Guyuan, whose expression had instantly turned solemn. Instead, he looked at the strange milky white vortex in the void that had stopped gathering the energy of heaven and earth. Exio Yan placed his hands behind his back. The aura of his entire body suddenly calmed down. He was like an ordinary person without any training. His eyes were as calm as an old well as he watched the white-colored energy vortex that was only a couple of feet away from him. It was as though he wanted to forcefully see through this white-colored energy vortex. Exio Yan just stood quietly in the void. However, the aura that appeared out of nowhere was like an incomparably sharp sword that charged into the sky. It cut through the sky and pierced through the void until it reached the end of the void. During the 10 years that Exio Yan had become a Didi, Exio Yan had been to the tombs of many ancient the experts. Although most of them had been destroyed by outsiders, there were still some that had not been discovered by the world. Even so, the information that he had obtained was still a drop in the bucket for Exio Yan. However, even under such circumstances, he had only stopped a year ago. From then on, Exio Yan had a strong premonition that Exio Exuin's resurrection method would be in the near future. Now, Exio Yan's premonition had arrived. Exio Exuin's resurrection method existed in the milky white energy vortex in front of him. Ancestor Exio Exuin, the younger generation, Exio Yan, is finally able to repay your kindness. Exio Yan thought to himself as he looked at the milky white energy vortex in front of him. He then turned his head to look at Exuin Er and Ci Lin. The two girls looked at Exio Yan with red-stained eyes. Their eyes were filled with a strong reluctance and love. Exio Yan reached out and hugged the two girls and their children. He took a deep breath of the faint fragrance on their bodies. Exio Yan's voice was filled with reluctance. "Take care of yourself and the children. Wait for my return." The two ladies quietly closed their eyes and nodded their heads in agreement. After which, Exio Yan looked at the little girl who was also nestled in his embrace. He bent his body and the corner of his mouth carried a loving and warm smile. Following which, he softly opened his mouth and said, Exayo, Exayo, as an elder sister, you have to take care of these two little brothers for mother. Exayo Yan finally could not endure it any longer when she heard Exayo Yan's instructions. Sparkling tears instantly fell from her red eyes. Her two slender arms hugged Exayo Yan's neck. Her exquisite head leaned tightly against Exayo Yan's chest as she cried loudly. By the side, Xuan and Cai Lin's red eyes became even redder when they saw this. Bright tears were about to fall like pearls. Exayo Yan's heart naturally could not remain calm when he saw this scene and heard the crying of his daughter in his embrace. However, he also knew that if he was unable to remain calm at this moment, it was likely that this family would worry about him all day long after he left if he was unable to remain calm. Exayo Yan swiftly sorted out the emotions in his heart. After which, he carried Exayo, who was nestled in his arms. The corners of his mouth revealed a warm smile as he looked at Xuan and Cai Lin. He opened his mouth and teased them. Girls, this is not a life and death parting. We are merely going to another place to play. It is not like we are never coming back. Why are you crying? Don't tell me that you don't believe in my strength. Xuan and Cai Lin quickly sorted out the emotions on their pretty faces after Exayo Yan uttered these words. They looked at each other and forced a smile. After which, they placed Exayo in Exayo Yan's arms and wiped away the tears on her tender face. After which, they gently placed her between Xuan and Cai Lin. Their bodies turned and their eyes landed on the two elders not far behind them. These two elders were clearly the two most important figures in Exayo Yan's growth. The first was his father, Exayo Jan. Before he became familiar with Yao Lao, Exayo Jan had always firmly believed in him, regardless of whether it was before those 3 years of being a useless person, during that period, or after that. Exayo Jan being captured by the Hu clan could be said to be the matter that Exayo Yan regretted the most in his life. If he had not been young and frivolous back then, causing his entire clan to be destroyed in his anger, his father would not have been captured. Of course, from another perspective, if Exayo Jan had not been captured and given Exayo Yan more motivation and desire for strength, it was likely that he would not have grown so quickly. It was difficult to say whether it was a blessing or a curse. The second person was the person who had the greatest influence on Exayo Yan's growth. He was also the person who was the most crucial. Yao Lao. If it had not been for Exayo Yan's 3 years of low point, Yao Lao would not have awakened. If it had not been for Exayo Yan's 3 years of low point, Exayo Yan would not have known how to endure. If it had not been for those 3 years, Exayo Yan would not have been able to form a good training foundation. If it had not been for those 3 years, Exayo Yan might not have broken off the engagement with Nalan Yanran. Perhaps, he would not have attracted the Misty Cloud sect. 3 years of being a useless person. Exayo Yan had been given the title of being a useless person. He had been given the cold shoulder and cursed. 3 years of being a useless person. Exayo Yan had caused Nalan Yanran to break off the engagement and break off the 3 years agreement. It was also because of this that he had incurred the anger of the Misty Cloud sect. However, if it had not been for these 3 years, Exayo Yan would not have been able to dominate the Black Corner region. If it had not been for these 3 years, Exayo Yan would not have been able to rely on his own strength to forcefully establish the Yan alliance and dominate the Xiama Empire. If it had not been for these 3 years, the Central Plains and Exayo Yan would never have been fated. On the other hand, the Exayo clan would no longer exist. If it had not been for these 3 years, Exayo Yan would not have been able to join hands with the various factions in the Central Plains to establish the Sky Mansion alliance. Moreover, he would not have been able to obtain the Do Di body that he currently possessed. Hence, everything that Exayo Yan currently possessed was inseparable from these two people. It could be said that without Exayo Jan's encouragement and support and Yao Lao's nurturing, Exayo Yan would have ended up in that small corner of the continent. That incomparably fascinating continent could only become the place that his heart yearned for. Yao Lao and Exayo Jan. After so many years, Yao Lao's strength had already reached the 6-star Do Sheng class. Although Exayo Jan was not as strong as Yao Lao, he had also reached the 3-star Do Sheng class. The two of them were currently the top experts on the Do Qi continent. Of course, even though this was the case, there were still many people on the continent who were stronger than them. However, no one would disrespect the two of them. Given their current status, even the clan leader of the Yan clan could not be compared with them. There was no other reason other than Exayo Yan, this top expert who had saved the entire Do Qi continent. Xiao Yan looked at the two old men. Suddenly, he bent his knees and knelt in the air. This caused everyone below to exclaim in admiration. There were also those who felt envious of Yao Lao and Xiao Yan for having such a strong descendant who was filial to his teacher. Although Yao Lao and Xiao Yan wanted to help Xiao Yan up when they saw this scene, Xiao Yan was an elite Dodi, a true peak existence on the continent. How could they, as mere Do Shengs, be able to stop the things that an elite Dodi wanted to do? Hence, the two old men could only watch as Xiao Yan kowtowed 10 times. Thank you, father, for raising me. Thank you, teacher, for teaching me. I am unfilial and will not be able to serve the two of you. I hope that the two of you will take care of your bodies in the future. Do not overwork yourself. You must prioritize your health. Xiao Yan suddenly opened his mouth and spoke. The old faces of the two old men, which were filled with the scars of time, were filled with a satisfied smile. Both of their eyes were also filled with white tears. In one's lifetime, being able to have such an outstanding descendant who respected his teacher could be considered to have not lived in vain. After kowtowing and thanking the two old men for raising and teaching him, Xiao Yan turned his head to look at the envious Zhu Kun by the side. He looked at the latter and asked in a doubtful manner. Uncle Zhu Kun, may I know what Zedai Yan is currently doing? Or is she unwilling to come and send me off? Xiao Yan was naturally aware of everyone's reluctance to part. This was something that could be seen from the fact that the little fairy doctor did not come. Hence, the tone of Xiao Yan's words contained a little apology. Haha, nephew Xiao Yan, you need not ask about this. That little girl does not have any intention of being unwilling to part with you. You need not think too much about it. You will naturally come to know about it in the future. You can rest assured and go. Ha 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 ha. However, Xiao Yan did not expect Zhu Kun's reply to be completely different from what he had expected. Xiao Yan did not say anything else after seeing Zhu Kun's eyes that were filled with confidence. Instead, he turned his body and faced those close friends who had helped him back then. His eyes swept over them one by one. Liu King, W. Hao and the rest were vaguely visible. A couple of breaths later, Xiao Yan faced them and cupped his hands together. He bowed deeply towards them. After which, he turned around and walked towards the cream-white energy vortex that was suspended in the empty space without turning his head back. The people behind him were stunned for a moment before they finally recovered. They looked at Xiao Yan's white figure, which was about to enter the vortex. Immediately, everyone bowed slightly. They cupped their hands together and cupped them towards Xiao Yan. At the same time, they cried out in unison. Farewell, Flame Emperor! Farewell, Flame Emperor! Farewell, Flame Emperor! The cries continued for a long time after Xiao Yan had disappeared before gradually coming to a stop. No one used any Do Qi when they shouted. They had only used their original loudest voice. This was a form of respect to those who respected them. Even so, the momentum still shook the entire continent. No one was unwilling in their hearts when everyone shouted. This was because the person they were shouting for was the person who had saved the entire Do Qi continent. That person was the Flame Emperor, Xiao Yan. Chapter 2, Life? Death? Xiao Yan stared blankly at the space in front of him within the cream-white swirl. Accurately speaking, he was staring at the dense white fog that was floating in the space. That was something that had already disappeared from the Do Qi continent. It was also something that Hu Tiandi had planned for 1,000 years back then. He had even sacrificed the entire continent to obtain it. The essence. TSK, the essence. Back then, Hu Tiandi had planned for 1,000 years just to obtain a trace of the D-tier embryonic pill. Now, however, these the essences are just like air. TSK, the world has really changed. As long as one becomes a Dodi, the D essence, TSK, would likely be much more abundant than air. Unfortunately, it is already impossible to return from this realm. Otherwise, if I were to give these the essences to father-in-law and elder Zhu Kun, I would be able to create to elite Dodi out of thin air. Ah, what a pity. Really, TSK. Xiao Yan let out a long sigh when he thought until this point. However, after thinking about it from another angle, Xiao Yan did not continue to think about it. Wu Yun and Zhu Kun were already very old. Moreover, they were the peak experts on the Do Qi continent. They had already gotten used to the leisurely life on the Do Qi continent. Now that they were asked to break through the bottleneck and become DD, even Xun Er and Ci Lin would not agree to it, much less Wu Yun. Hence, Exio Yan's body moved and he flew towards the white fog in front of him. While Exio Yan was advancing, he did not discover that the D essences were slowly gathering towards Exio Yan at a speed that was not visible to the naked eye. They actually passed through his clothes and entered Exio Yan's body. After which, they merged with Exio Yan's Do Qi and body. However, as the person in charge, Exio Yan was completely unaware of this. He continued to advance towards the dense white fog in front of him. After an unknown period of time, Exio Yan finally stopped, but his brows were tightly knitted, and his expression was extremely unsightly. Exio Yan didn't deliberately calculate how long he had been walking, so he didn't know how long he had been walking. But no matter what, it should have been about 10 days or half a month. But from the beginning until now, there was still a white fog in front of him. There was nothing. Exio Yan had tried to change directions, but the result was the same. He couldn't find anything that looked like a way out. Exio Yan had no choice but to unleash his Emperor Realm Spirit. However, he still couldn't find anything. Instead, he felt that there was something wrong with the spiritual energy he had withdrawn. However, he couldn't pinpoint what exactly was wrong. This caused Exio Yan's expression to become even more solemn. Until later, Exio Yan's body actually felt a little swollen. He originally thought that he couldn't adapt to the Emperor's essence, so he tried to move faster. However, he found that the faster he moved, the more swollen his body felt. Until just now, Exio Yan inadvertently noticed that his hand was actually filled with tiny cracks. Under Exio Yan's careful observation, Exio Yan found that his entire body was like this. At this moment, Exio Yan's heart was both frightened and solemn. He was actually seriously injured without knowing it, and his body was on the verge of collapse. Exio Yan wanted to use his Do Qi to forcefully suppress it, but just as he circulated his Do Qi, he found that in this short period of time, he was already unable to use his Do Qi, let alone suppress his injuries. Damn it, what exactly is going on? Why is it like this? My body? My Do Qi? Why is it like this? What exactly is going on? Is there no one stronger than a Do Di? Don't tell me that what my spiritual strength has sensed all these years is just an illusion. Did those elite Do Di from the ancient times all die here? In that case, what is the point of being a Do Di? For some unknown reason, Exio Yan's heart actually roared furiously in an irritable manner. I am unwilling to accept this. For teacher, father, Exuan ER, clan and the entire Do Qi continent, I continued to train. I underwent 9 changes and became a Sheng. Finally, I broke through the restriction of the Do Sheng stage, transformed into a Di and defeated Hu Tiandi. However, why is it all a joke in the end? I am unwilling to accept this. I am unwilling to accept this. Exio Yan thought until this point in his heart. He lifted his head and emitted a hoarse roar that was unwilling to accept this. He did his best to roar towards the sky. At this moment, Exio Yan's hair was a mess. His face was bright red. Traces of fresh blood continued to flow out from the cracks on the skin on his face, dyeing Exio Yan's entire body blood red. He had turned into a blood person. Both of his eyes were filled with blood and protruded outwards. The muscles all over his body were tense as he stood straight on the spot. At a glance, he appeared just like a crazy magical beast. He looked extremely ferocious. Suddenly, Exio Yan's body fell backwards. Both of his eyes were slowly shut. His spiritual strength continued to spread and disappear involuntarily. If someone were to see this scene at this moment, he would definitely recognize that this was a sign that the spiritual essence was about to collapse. However, the spiritual strength did not disappear. Instead, it merged into one with the Di essence in an extremely strange state. Exio Yan's body fell downwards. His speed was unusually fast. If there was a rock below Exio Yan's body at this moment, Exio Yan's body would definitely be smashed to pieces and he would die on the spot. During the process of falling unconscious, Exio Yan had a dream. He dreamed of his 3 years of being a good for nothing. He dreamed of the ridicule of his clansmen. He dreamed of the joys and dangers of following his teacher to roam the continent. he dreamed of the joys and sorrows of parting and reuniting with Xun Er. But suddenly, all of this began to disappear. Xiao Yan watched his friends and relatives leave him one by one. Xiao Yan wanted to keep them, but he was powerless. Looking at Xun Er's figure gradually fading away, Xiao Yan suddenly reached out to grab Xun Er. However, his hand was still empty. There was nothing. Xiao Yan's hands clenched into fists in his dream. He rode towards the sky in grief and indignation. Ah! Xun Er! The heavens are unfair. The heavens are unfair. At the same time, Xiao Yan, who was constantly falling in reality, also reached out to grab. However, the result was different. In his hand, there was an additional strand of silver-white light. At this moment, this strand of silver-white light was constantly struggling due to the sudden solidification. It was trying to break free from Xiao Yan's hand. Although Xiao Yan could not use Do Qi at this moment, Xiao Yan was the Flame Emperor. His physical strength was extremely strong. How could a tiny strand of silver-white light escape from his hand? Hence, after struggling for a while to no avail, it finally came to a stop. It appeared to have collapsed as it quietly lay on Xiao Yan's hand and followed Xiao Yan as they fell. Chapter 3. It was inexplicably familiar. This was a vast and boundless forest. At a glance, in the depths of the forest, there was a tall mountain peak that was half red and half white. It towered into the clouds like a pillar to the sky. At this moment, in an open space in the forest, a red flaming figure was sitting cross-legged on the ground. Above his head, a huge energy vortex was rotating slowly. The energy of heaven and earth was converging at an extremely fast speed, forming bursts of energy gusts in the surroundings, causing a few nearby trees to fall in response to the wind. However, a man in white lying on the open space beside him, who was in a coma, was safe and sound. He was not affected by the hurricane at all. After a while, the flaming figure stood up from the ground. The flames dissipated, revealing a handsome face. Between his eyebrows, a half-black and half-red flame mark was faintly glowing. However, at this moment, he frowned and looked at the man lying beside him. After checking that the man was fine, he raised his head and looked at the mountain peak in the distance. He sat down cross-legged again and quietly waited for him to wake up. After a long time, Xiao Yan slowly stood up from the ground with a slight cough. Ahem, I'm still alive? My injuries are healed? On one hand, Xiao Yan observed his surroundings. On the other hand, he used his mind to observe the interior of his body. However, he found that there was no change in his body except for some more emperor's sources. Even the blood that flowed out from his original physical injuries was not there. This made Xiao Yan feel as if he was dreaming. When he turned his head, he saw the flaming figure sitting cross-legged beside him. Ho Yi? By the way, Ho Yi, do you still remember what happened in that space? Xiao Yan did not react until he saw Ho Yi, and then he asked a little strangely. Xiao Yan found it strange that when he was on the verge of death, Ho Yi did not appear. Ho Yi and Xiao Yan were originally one. Although it had its own intelligence, how could it ignore Xiao Yan when he was in danger? This made Xiao Yan feel very strange, but he was too embarrassed to ask too directly, so he asked in a roundabout way. I remember. I also saw the entire process of you being injured. Ho Yi replied in a somewhat apologetic manner. It seemed to have sensed the doubt in Xiao Yan's words and continued. However, I am unable to help you. I am even unable to warn you because all of my strength was sealed the moment I entered the vortex. It was futile no matter how I struggled. Xiao Yan gradually understood that Ho Yi had nearly lost his life despite his strength as a Doudi. What could Ho Yi's current 9-star Do Xiao Yan was considered a 9-star Do Xiao Yan. If nothing unexpected happened, there was no need to save him. Xiao Yan's strength had also continued to grow during these 10 years. It had reached the peak of the 9-star Do Sheng class and was only a step away from the perfect 9-star Do Sheng class. Even though this was the case, it was still unable to help Xiao Yan. This caused Little Yi to feel quite helpless. Xiao Yan had changed Ho Yi's name to Ho Yi because Ho Yi's outer appearance was no longer that of an infant. Moreover, Ho Yi already possessed its own intelligence. It was equivalent to two people's thoughts being gathered on Xiao Yan alone, causing the two of them to feel extremely uncomfortable in their hearts. Hence, the thoughts between the two of them had been severed by Xiao Yan. However, the heavenly flame was ultimately Xiao Yan's. Hence, Xiao Yan had put in a lot of effort to remove Huo Yi's consciousness from the heavenly flame. After which, he used the heavenly flame to create a fire spirit body for Huo Yi. Finally, he had used the heavenly flame to nourish it for a couple of years before he succeeded. Hence, Xiao Yan was currently able to use the heavenly flame. Huo Yi had also become an alternative heavenly flame after practicing the life transformation flame secret technique that Xiao Yan had obtained back then. Huo Yi flipped his hand after he finished speaking. A silver-white band of light appeared in his hand. It continued to twist and struggle. Tiny spatial cracks continued to appear in the surrounding space. Xiao Yan raised his eyebrows and looked at Huo Yi strangely. This was a wisp of space force. With Xiao Yan's vision, he could naturally see the extraordinariness of this wisp of space force. After all, the ordinary space force did not have spiritual wisdom like this wisp of space force. Although the spiritual wisdom of this wisp of space force was not high, it was enough to show its extraordinariness. You grabbed it when you were in that space. When I appeared earlier, I found that you were holding it tightly, so I temporarily put it away for you. As soon as Xiao Yan heard that he had caught it, he immediately remembered the dream he had. Fortunately, it was just a dream. Otherwise, Xiao Yan really didn't know how to keep himself alive. After calming down a little, Xiao Yan not only did not reach out to grab back the wisp of silver-white space force, but instead, he stretched out his palm. A golden light flashed, and above his palm, a thunder dragon flashing with golden light was constantly hovering. Looking at the wisp of space force, it kept making excited dragon roars. Little Jin? What are you doing? This golden dragon that Xiao Yan called Little Jin was the 9 mysterious golden lightning that had luckily retained its spiritual wisdom because of Xiao Yan back then. However, its strength had greatly decreased because of Xiao Yan, and it had fallen all the way to the 1-star Do Zun class. However, it had unexpectedly treated Xiao Yan as its family. This caused Xiao Yan to be speechless. However, due to the affection that Xiao Yan and the other children had for it, Xiao Yan silently agreed. After all, this 9 mysterious golden lightning had once helped Xiao Yan. Hence, Xiao Yan had helped it recover its strength during these 10 years. It had even allowed its strength to reach the Dou Sheng class and become a first-year Dou Sheng. However, Xiao Yan had never expected that this little fellow would actually follow him in. Moreover, from the looks of it, it seemed that it wanted to swallow this wisp of space force. Xiao Yan looked at the 9 mysterious golden lightning in front of him, and then at the wisp of space force. After thinking for a moment, he withdrew his hand. In an instant, Little Jin was like a wild horse that had escaped its reins. In a flash, it appeared in front of the wisp of space force. That small snake-like space force also seemed to have sensed a dangerous aura. It curled up and trembled repeatedly. Little Jin excitedly circled around it. Suddenly, a golden light appeared on its body and wrapped around the tiny wisp of space force. The little fellow continued to roll around and emit a hiss. Finally, a carefree dragon roar was emitted from Little Jin's mouth a moment later. It flipped in the air and returned to Xiao Yan's arm. After which, it fell into a deep slumber and began to refine the energy that it had obtained earlier. Xiao Yan looked at Little Jin, who had returned to his arm. He smiled and shook his head. After which, he looked at Huo Yi and asked, "Where is the black flame? Why is he not with you?" The black flame that Xiao Yan had mentioned was the nihility devouring flame from back then. Back then, it had returned to the heavenly flame square in order to seal Hu Tiandi. However, after 10 years, Hu Tiandi's soul had already been destroyed. The nihility devouring flame had also left the heavenly flame square and regained its freedom. However, due to it wanting to become an emperor, it had continued to follow beside Xiao Yan. However, it was unwilling to acknowledge Xiao Yan as its master. Hence, Xiao Yan had merged a portion of the heavenly flame essence with Huo Yi. This allowed both parties to know the approximate location of the other party. This would make it easier for them to search for each other after the matter with Xiao Yan occurred. However, Huo Yi did not reply after hearing these words. Instead, he turned his head and looked at the tall mountain peak, which had a distinct red and white color. A trace of doubt lingered within his eyes. Chapter 4. Xiao Yan followed Huo Yi's line of sight and looked into the distance. At the end of his line of sight was a tall red and white mountain peak that pierced through the clouds. Xiao Yan frowned slightly. When he glanced over just now, he clearly felt that there seemed to be something familiar there that attracted him, but that feeling disappeared in a flash. After a glance, he could not feel anything. You should have noticed something, right? Huo Yi looked at the huge mountain peak at the end of his line of sight with a puzzled face and asked. That's right. I did sense something. But what exactly is it? It gave me a very familiar feeling, but that feeling was so faint that I couldn't figure it out. Xiao Yan frowned slightly and replied with a puzzled and curious face. Then he withdrew his gaze and looked at the sky above his head. But it's also because of this that I'm now a little interested in this world. Xiao Yan said half jokingly and half seriously. Then he turned his head to look at Huo Yi and said, let's go. Let's go. Let's see what it is that can make us, who have never been here before, feel so familiar. As soon as his voice fell, Xiao Yan was about to step into the air, but in the next moment, his figure suddenly stopped. This was because the moment he circulated the Do Qi in his body, a wild wind blew within a 1,000-kilometer radius of where Xiao Yan was located. Clouds rose in an instant, and dark clouds covered the sky. On the ground, numerous towering trees fell with the wind. Only Xiao Yan and Huo Yi remained standing. They were not the least bit affected by this hurricane. Initially, Xiao Yan was also shocked by everything that had happened so suddenly that he jumped up. Following which, he appeared to have thought of something and his face revealed surprise as he watched everything in front of him. He was not the slightest bit moved by the falling of these trees. This was not because he was devoid of humanity and had no respect for the world, but at this moment, the rise of the Do Qi in his body had made him so excited that he could not extricate himself. How could he care about these things? This is the sign of overflowing Do Qi and about to break through. It seems that those emperor's sources are not useless. Now that I'm in this situation, it is most likely related to those emperor's sources. It seems that the idea of going there will have to be put aside for the time being. Once Xiao Yan finished speaking, he did not say anything else. He immediately sat cross-legged on the ground. He had already used his spiritual perception to investigate. The humans and magical beasts within a 500-kilometer radius had already been completely eliminated by the Huo Yi. The area where they were located would definitely not be affected at all. Therefore, Xiao Yan was very reassured as he sat cross-legged on the ground and began to make sufficient preparations for the upcoming breakthrough. The Do Qi in Xiao Yan's Do Qi continued to circulate along his meridians and was then refined by the heavenly fire. Finally, it returned to the flame vortex at the center of the vortex of Do Qi. Ever since Xiao Yan's strength had reached the Do Di class, the vortex within his body had undergone a huge change. Before reaching the Do Di level, everyone's vortex relied on absorbing the energy from the outside world. After which, it would be sealed and merged into one's body before being used. But as long as one's strength reached the Do rank, the vortex in one's body would transform into a new space in the center, which was specially used to store and refine the Do Qi absorbed from the outside world. And this space would also continue to expand as one's strength increased. The stronger one's strength, the greater the amount of Do Qi stored. It would greatly reduce the consumption of Do Qi during battle. Moreover, this space also had a certain isolation ability. Unless the opponent's strength far exceeded one's own or had some heaven-defying cultivation method or Do Qi, it would be impossible to confine the Do Qi circulation in one's body. This also greatly avoided unnecessary injuries caused by some petty actions in battle. After half an hour, Xiao Yan, who was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, opened his eyes in surprise. A sharp flame beam shot out from his eyes and disappeared into the void. Phew. Finally, I haven't dared to really use Do Qi for 10 years. Now that I have circulated it, it is indeed much more carefree. Huo Yi, I am about to break through. Help me, God. In the past 10 years, Xiao Yan had been suppressing the Do Qi in his body all the time. If not, Xiao Yan would have already arrived at this place. Xiao Yan exhaled a mouthful of turbid Qi from his body. He suppressed the excitement in his heart and said to Huo Yi. When Huo Yi heard Xiao Yan's slightly trembling words, he nodded heavily without hesitation. Then, he jumped up and flew thousands of miles away to guard Xiao Yan. Xiao Yan sat calmly. Both of his hands formed a training seal. The Do Qi in his body began to circulate along the Qi channels of the flame mantra. Following the circulation of the Do Qi in Xiao Yan's body, the energy between heaven and earth also unceasingly gathered toward Xiao Yan. As the circulation speed of the Do Qi in Xiao Yan's body continued to increase, Xiao Yan's body uncontrollably rose into the air. The energy of heaven and earth also formed a huge energy whirlpool around his body. The energy of heaven and earth also followed the energy whirlpool and crazily gathered toward Xiao Yan's body. After entering the QI channels in Xio Yan's body, it was continuously refined and absorbed by the mysterious flame in Xio Yan's body. Then, it was transported through the QI channels into the flame whirlpool in the middle of the vortex. At this moment, the space within the flame whirlpool was filled with rich and pure milky white Do QI. This space was also constantly expanding and contracting. It was as if it was waiting to complete a breakthrough after gathering enough energy and evolve into an even wider space. Crack. However, at this moment, a clear cracking sound sounded from Xio Yan's finger in the outside world, causing Xio Yan to suddenly wake up. It nearly caused the mortal Do QI in Xio Yan's body to go berserk and suffer a backlash. This was actually Xio Yan's serene sea storage ring. It had been forcefully shattered by this powerful energy. The things inside were piled up like a small mountain. If it was an ordinary time, Xio Yan would naturally not bother. However, a portion of Xio Yan's spiritual origin was currently still in the jade bottle in Xio Yan's storage ring. If the jade bottle was accidentally shattered by this powerful energy, Xio Xuan would really completely disappear from this world. If the result really turned out like this, Xio Yan would definitely feel guilty toward Xio Xuan for the rest of his life. This would cause him to become dispirited and a heart demon would form. This would cause Xio Xuan's cultivation to regress instead of advancing. In the end, he would truly become a cripple. Hence, Xio Yan hurriedly did his best to suppress the Do QI that was about to go berserk in his body. He used a portion of his Do QI to wrap the jade bottle with an energy barrier to protect it. After which, he focused on breaking through his strength. However, Xio Yan, who was in a hurry to break through, did not realize that the thread of Xio Xuan's spiritual origin within the jade bottle that was being protected was unceasingly absorbing the emperor essence that had been gathered from Xio Yan's breakthrough. Threads of life energy were also being released from it. It was like a huge sleeping dragon twisting its body. However, Xio Yan had no way of knowing everything that was happening. Huo Yi was also protecting Xio Yan in the distance. Naturally, no one knew everything that was happening in this small jade bottle. Chapter 5, Divine Bloodline. In an open space in a vast forest, the forest looked as if it had just gone through a great battle. The surrounding trees had been uprooted and were extremely damaged. The ground was also covered with broken ancient trees. Only the figure sitting cross-legged in the air was still dressed in snow-white clothes. His clothes were neat and fluttering in the wind, bringing about whistling sounds. Around his body, a huge energy vortex was spinning at an extremely fast speed, gathering the spiritual QI between heaven and earth, emitting whistling sounds like the wailing of ghosts and howling of wolves. Faintly, some spatial cracks appeared between heaven and earth, making it look even more ferocious and terrifying. At this moment, the Do QI within Xio Yan's body was densely packed. It was like an inflated balloon that was continuously contracting and expanding. That special space was also continuously absorbing the Linki that Xio Yan had refined. However, that Linki storage space, which appeared to be continuously contracting and expanding, was still incomparably firm as it was about to break through its restraints and explode. Seeing this, Xio Yan operated the flame mantra even more crazily. The Do QI in his meridians surged wildly. The heavenly flame quickly passed through his meridians, refining the spiritual QI that Xio Yan had absorbed from the outside world. However, this was still not enough. Most of the spiritual QI contained Emperor's source. However, Xio Yan's heavenly flame was unable to refine the Emperor's source. When the heavenly flame refined the spiritual QI of heaven and earth, it had to remove the Emperor's source from it. This also caused Xio Yan's absorption of the spiritual QI of heaven and earth to be even slower. If this continued, the final result would definitely be failure. However, at this moment, an incomparably fierce suction force came from elsewhere. It was unknown whether it was intentional or not, but the suction force actually only absorbed the Emperor's source. The Emperor's source between heaven and earth seemed to have received an order at this moment and rapidly flowed in the direction of the suction force. The speed at which Xio Yan absorbed the spiritual QI of heaven and earth also increased. Waves of pure Do QI poured into the strange space, causing the Do QI inside to constantly increase. The space also became more and more swollen. It was clear that the space was not far from the final rupture. However, Xio Yan frowned slightly. Where did this unknown guy come from? He even broke through the guard of Huo Yi. Now, if one looked at the space where Xio Yan was now from the outside, one would discover that the huge energy vortex that appeared when Xio Yan was constantly cultivating and breaking through, now there were two. The only difference between them was that the swirl behind Xio Yan was absorbing the natural energy of the world, emitting an extremely powerful and overbearing aura. On the other hand, the swirl on the other side was absorbing the essence of the world. The milky white Emperor's source seemed to be dancing in the air. It slowly rotated and condensed into a mysterious drop of milk-like liquid and disappeared into the void in a flash. Although the milky white whirlpool rotated very slowly, what was unexpected was that all the Emperor's source between heaven and earth was pulled over, which looked extremely magical. The amount of energy that the two absorbed was different, causing the color of the enormous energy whirlpool that could cover an area to be different as well. It was as though two giant beasts were fighting for the energy of the world. Looking at it from afar, it gave off a unique feeling. Huo Yi, who was 100 miles away, was slightly surprised when he saw this scene. Logically speaking, under his power, it was impossible for anyone to break in under his guard, let alone within 100 feet of Xiao Yan. But in the next moment, his furrowed brows relaxed again. Instead, he looked curiously at the strange energy vortex because he just found that Xiao Yan, who was originally cultivating slowly, was gradually accelerating because of the inexplicable vortex that came out of nowhere. It seemed that this unknown suction force was helping Xiao Yan. The increase in Xiao Yan's training speed also meant that Xiao Yan was one step closer to breaking through. Why should he bother about it? What is that thing? Why is it helping big brother Xiao Yan? Huo Yi was happy for Xiao Yan, but at the same time, he was worried. The wind around Xiao Yan's body was constantly blowing, and the spiritual qi of heaven and earth was constantly pouring into Xiao Yan's body. The flame mantra was operating at an extremely fast speed, and the mysterious flame in his body was constantly refining and absorbing the mottled energy. The Do qi in the strange space was extremely rich, and the space barrier was constantly trembling, and cracks had appeared. Since Xiao Yan discovered these cracks, he was even more excited. He worked even harder to absorb the spiritual qi of heaven and earth, and the Emperor's source between heaven and earth was also gathering in another direction at an extremely fast speed. Soon after, with a crisp cracking sound, a vigorous aura soared into the sky between heaven and earth, bringing with it bursts of wind whistling, as if a giant dragon was flying in the sky. Xiao Yan slowly opened his eyes, and a light flashed in front of his eyes. He then stood up, and with a crackling sound, Xiao Yan performed a set of fist skills. Finally, Xiao Yan exhaled a long breath, and murmured to himself excitedly. The feeling of breaking through is really something that I haven't experienced for a long time, it's really comfortable. Then he looked around again, and frowned. The strange vortex had disappeared. Xiao Yan pondered for a moment, and no longer thought about it. After all, he didn't lose anything, and there was no change in his body, so he naturally didn't pay attention to it. Looking at the burst serene sea storage ring, he leaned over and put the jade bottle into his arms. Then he waved his hand in the void, and a dark space crack appeared. He put the other items into it, then he turned and flew in the direction of Huo Yi. With Xiao Yan's current strength, he could tear the void at will. Just now, it was just a space that Xiao Yan temporarily opened up for convenience. However, at the moment when Xiao Yan put the jade bottle into his arms, the jade bottle emitted a faint light, and even Xiao Yan didn't notice it. At the same time, in a splendidly decorated hall tens of thousands of miles away from Xiao Yan, an old man in white was staring in shock at a crystal ball in the middle of the stone table in front of him, which was emitting a bright golden light. The old man in white stared at the crystal ball in front of him with his eyes wide open, and his mouth wide open. He stared blankly at the crystal ball in front of him until the light of the crystal ball dissipated, and then he shouted excitedly. Divine bloodline. Ha 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 ha. God is really helping my Xiao clan. Ha 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 ha. Before his voice fell, his figure disappeared from the hall in a flash, leaving only bursts of vigorous and heroic echoes reverberating in the hall. After the old man disappeared in a flash, the crystal ball suddenly shone again after a moment of silence. This time, the light was even brighter than the previous golden light. It actually emitted a gorgeous seven-colored light, which dazzled the entire hall. It was a pity that the old man had already left. He didn't have the chance to see this dazzling scene again.